but I'm getting ahead of myself.
A little bit of a history lesson because...
And we are back with another episode of our live stream for the many. It's also going to be a podcast. It's going to be on the web. It's on Facebook and Twitter right now. And so basically, I just wanted to have Cody come.
It was the worst day on Wall Street since the crash of 1987.
This is the only world I've ever known.
This could be the most serious recession in decades.
A system on the brink of collapse. But I'm getting ahead of myself.
A little bit of a history lesson because during the Depression, the Glass-Steagall Act was introduced to split up banks and brokers. 10 years ago today, that act was repealed, a move that some now blame for the financial collapse.
That was the moment when these failing companies came to my parents and my neighbors and begged them to become investors and save them. And we did.
And that means life, as most Americans know it, is about to change, in some cases dramatically.
Now, I was one of the lucky ones. My dad didn't lose his job, and we weren't one of the millions that lost their homes or life savings. But as the years passed, I watched as we all started to accept that this is just how things were now. That money would be tight, and that more of us would live paycheck to paycheck as we saved more for college and paid more for our trips to the doctor, and we just held on. I watched my dad become a diabetic and the cost of insulin skyrocket. I watched as my friends lost their jobs and their health insurance when the companies they had worked at for 20 years moved their jobs overseas. In that time, I graduated college, I paid off my student loans, I started my first company with $3,000 in my pocket, and 2 years later, I started another one. And I became a member of the first generation that will not do better than their parents. And this whole time, I watched as the companies that my family and my neighbors had invested in, they got back on their feet, and they did better than ever. And we were left behind. And the more I watched, the more I started to realize that these things can be different. That every dollar we invested then, it's now worth so much more than we realize. It's worth enough to cover the extra cost of college. It's worth enough to cover everyone's cancer treatment. It's worth more than enough to make sure that no new mom has to worry about paying for someone to watch their kids while they go to work. And it's enough to cover all of the predatory loans that have been stopping entire generations from buying a home. What I understand now is that we've already paid for all of these things. Most investors, they expect to get their money back after 5 years. And we've spent 12 watching and waiting and hoping. And now, it's time. It's time that we demand the return on our investment. I'm Adam Christensen, and I believe that one's economic value does not equal their human worth. I'm running for Congress. In this campaign, it's for the many, not just me.
And we are back with another episode of our live stream for the many. It's also going to be a podcast. It's going to be on the web. It's on Facebook and Twitter right now. And so basically, I just wanted to have Cody come back for this week so we could just discuss a little bit about what's been going on and basically update everybody. And then we have Dr. Jessie Hawkins, who I was able to interview. And so we are going to be playing that right after me and Cody get done. And so this should last about an hour. Anyway, Cody, what are we talking about today?
What's going on? Let's kind of dive in a little bit because we have to talk a little bit about the news, and then we're going to dive into coronavirus and a lot about kind of what the fact that this didn't really have to happen to this extreme, but it did. Let's talk about the news a little bit. One of the biggest things I've been seeing over the weekend, the White House rejected a bailout for the Postal Service. Basically, the Postal Service requested money because their revenue has gone down tremendously, and they already every single year barely break even because they have to pay for pensions for all their workers. It's required. And
so
basically
everybody
President
has
Trump
to pay for pensions. What happened was Congress basically said under George W. Bush that they have to pay for their pensions 50 years in advance.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
no
correct.
other business ever has to do that. No other company, no other government service. Nobody has to do that except for the U.S. Postal Service. And the reason is because Republicans wanted to bankrupt the Postal Service, or at least make it look like it wasn't making any money. In reality, the Postal Service does very well, and they also provide a service. It's not a company. And the reason that they provide the service is so they can actually do affordable mail in rural parts of the country. And so if you wanted to send your grandmother a birthday card through FedEx or UPS, it would cost you about $11. If you want to send a card to your grandmother who lives in Alabama through the USPS, it costs you 50, 60 cents. That's the difference. And so right now, basically, this was obvious. This was always going to happen. And as soon as it did start happening, the people who have been wanting to privatize the Postal Service for 50, 60 years, I mean, it's their dream. I mean, it's something that they have wanted to do forever. Right. They've never gotten the opportunity because it's just dumb. And now they're basically going to allow it to fail on purpose because, well, there's two reasons. Cody, what's the first one?
Well, the first one, at least from what I have learned, is Trump wants Amazon to put in a lot of money towards their shipping and all that, which will in turn hurt Jeff Bezos, who is a critic of Donald Trump. Jeff Bezos
also owns what?
The Washington Post.
Yeah. And so Jeff Bezos, because he owns the Washington Post, and the Washington Post has written some bad stories about him, he's going to let a government agency that has been around since the Pony Express go under simply because he's trying to hold a grudge. And then the other reason is, and this is the one that Republicans have been trying to make forever, it's that the U.S. Postal Service doesn't make money. In reality, the U.S. Postal Service makes a ton of money. But what they have decided to do, and by them, I mean not the Postal Service, Congress, and Republicans in Congress, especially, and libertarians, they decided to basically make it so that the books of the USPS look like they are failing every single year because they're not supposed to make money. In fact, if that is what they're being judged on, of course they're not, because you're not letting them. And so at this point, there's two reasons. One is petty and stupid, and the other one is worse. Just plain corrupt.
They're basically both petty and stupid. And, the fact that senators and everyone have tried to put it in the bill to create a package for the Postal Service that they don't have to pay back, they don't have to do anything. It's just given to them. And it's been told to them that Donald Trump will not sign it.
There is one other reason that I kind of forgot about. When you do vote by mail, especially in a pandemic, who's that going to go through? It's going to go through the Postal Service. Guess what? You get rid of the Postal Service, you can't vote by mail anymore unless it costs $11 to $13, at which point a lot of people are just like, screw it, not doing it. And so at this point...
And a lot of people don't have extra funds to spend.
No, they don't. A lot of people don't even have $13, especially right now in this time. So you got a pandemic. Your only way of voting safely is through mailing in a ballot. So what are they going to do? They're going to get rid of the only entity that can do that on purpose, so that less people vote. They're going to hold a grudge, and at the same time, they're going to fulfill a dream that they've had for 60, 70 years of basically getting rid of one of the last government agencies that pays a really good wage to lots of people and runs everywhere around the country. And so at this point, it's disgraceful, and I can't believe I have to say this, but so they're trying to intentionally bankrupt one of our best agencies. Yeah, your mail sometimes doesn't get there on time, but guess what? If you wanted the mail to get there in 2 days, sending it halfway across the country, it's going to cost you $10 to $15. With the USPS, it costs 50 cents. So if you really want to pay 10 to 100 times more for a single letter, a single package, sure. Let's privatize the USPS.
Right. Yeah. It's like an average of like 35 times more to do like a standard shipping from the USPS compared to FedEx or UPS or anything like that. Yeah, it's completely ridiculous. One of the other things that you hear all the time in the news is, the stock market is the economy. And if the stock market's up, the economy's up. And that's just not true. That's a talking point. And there's a really great opinion article this weekend from BuzzFeed News, where it was talking about kind of what the economy really is. And there's two sides of the debate. More conservative right side is basically, like I just said, if the stock market's up, if everything looks good there, then the economy is doing really, really well. Whereas progressive debate has been for a long time is that's not really what we should look at when it comes to how the economy is doing. It's the group of people. Like, how are workers doing? How are everyday people doing? Not just the super rich, not just all of that. And it made a really good point of pointing out that the economy is only as good as the workers. And I really wanted to bring that up, and I kind of want to hear your thoughts.
Well, there was there was a meme that came out. It was a screenshot from Jim Cramer's show, and it basically in the background said, "Largest jump in the stock market since the 1970s," and right below it, the graphic was 16 million people file for unemployment. And I don't think that there is a better contrast than that of. It looks like the stock market and the economy is doing great, and yet you have 10% of people who in the workforce that are no longer employed. And so somebody please tell me how the economy is the stock market, because when I look around, I see people who can't make their rent or their mortgage, and then I see that the stock market is having one of its biggest bumps ever. And to me, I think that you have to say at this point, what the stock market does is not reality. And what the stock market is doing is in no way attached to the world that we are living in. At this point, we have to say that the economy is not the stock market. The economy is people's wages plus their opportunity minus their expenses. That's an easy formula for what the economy is. And if that number at the end of the day means that you still have money left over at the month, that's an okay economy. That's not great. It's okay. And right now, we do not have a good economy. What we have is basically... I
don't even think if we have that.
Basically, we have a stock market.
I don't even think we have an okay economy.
No, I don't even think we have an okay economy. At this point, what the stock market is a bunch of gamblers, a bunch of speculators who realized that the government just announced that they were going to give them a crap ton of money with no strings attached. That is what the stock market is, and that's why it went up. not because the economy is good, not because anything in our lives actually makes sense. It's simply because somebody promised them a blank check. And yet you and me, struggling. People around us, struggling. What is it? 53% of people under the age of 45 have either lost their job or lost parts of their wages in the last 3 weeks. 53%. I mean, that's...
And we're a part of that 53%.
Yeah.
I mean, both of us are a part of it.
So tell me, Cody, in what delusional world should the stock market be going up right now?
The only reason it's going up is exactly like you said. There was a bailout and given to them, and now they're able to. And CEOs and people like that haven't lost any money yet.
Well, you know who got bailed out, Cody? You know who got bailed out? The hedge funds. Hedge funds who hold billionaires' money and then they go and gamble it. Oh, and the people who go and buy crappy debt. The people who buy unsecured tranched debt, just like in the financial crisis. That's who we just bailed out. We didn't bail out anyone that mattered. We bailed out people who are gamblers. And I don't know if you saw the video. I posted like 5 times on Twitter so far. But basically, it is a CEO that basically he goes onto CNBC and the host asks him, are you actually arguing that airlines should go bankrupt? And the guy's exact response is, yes.
Yep.
Yes, they should go bankrupt. And he's like, well, how can you square that, with what is going on? It's not their fault. And his response was, yes, it is. And let's also be very clear that we're being lied to, because money that goes to the CEO and the executives and to the investors is not money that actually helps people. The people that the government decided to bail out with an airline industry bailout, it's the people who basically decided that this company is too big to fail, so I'm going to buy the worst possible debt I can. People in 2008, they called it basically a pile of crap, a triple A pile of crap or a single A pile of crap. And basically they said, I'm going to buy as much of these piles of craps as possible because I know the government, when they come in, they're going to just give me money for owning it. I don't have to do anything. And so what he said is basically in a packaged bankruptcy, like these airlines should have to go through, the people that would lose money are the speculators, the gamblers, and the people who basically are irresponsible with their money, but they knew somebody else would come and save them and that they would make a lot of money by doing it. And so basically they're people that gamble. And there are people like giant hedge funds that basically just gamble with billions of dollars. That's what they do. That's what they're good at. They buy up debt. They buy up stock. They buy up stuff that nobody would ever buy simply because they know that nobody's going to let that go down. Why? Because the CEOs would get hurt or the investors would get hurt. And what the guy basically said is let them fail, because in a packaged bankruptcy, workers come out better. The pensions typically are fine because they can't really do anything with it unless it's a corporate raid, essentially. The pensions do fine. At the end of the day, the workers typically end up owning more of the company. And when you break up these companies like American Airlines, that's what happens. That's what would happen is they would get broken up into smaller airlines, at which point the workers own more of those companies. And now you have competition in the market. So if you actually believe in capitalism, if you actually believe in a free market, you let them go bankrupt. Why? Because there's a system in place to make sure that the people that matter survive and the people who don't, who cares? And so that was his whole point was, so what, a billionaire doesn't get to take his family to the Hamptons 4 times a year? Who cares? We don't care about them.
Right. Yeah. And these kind of companies got bailed out. The ones that have gambled for years and years, even when things were really, really good and they were making a giant profit and everything, they've done nothing but gamble. All that, they didn't put anything back. They didn't do anything like that.
Yeah, but 12 years ago, they got bailed out and they decided, you know what? Let's do the exact same thing that screwed everybody again. Why? Because we'll just make more money.
But you know who didn't get bailed out? The Postal Service.
Yeah.
So
way to bring it back around. All right. So basically what we wanted to talk about this week was essentially why what is happening now with bailouts, with everything that's going on with the pandemic, why it shouldn't have happened. Because in reality, these things should not have happened. You should not be at home right now. You should be at work. It just shouldn't have happened.
And so let's point out also, so none of this should have happened. We should not have recorded this many deaths. But as of recording,
we shouldn't have even had to shut down the economy. We should not have even had to shut down the economy. Literally. So, I mean, keep going, but.
Yeah. As of this recording, the U.S. has 23,068 deaths, and worldwide we're at 118,000 deaths.
We have the most cases worldwide, right?
Mm-hmm. Correct.
So, and I'm going to talk to Dr. Hawkins about this a little bit later, but we had our first case on the exact same day as South Korea.
Yep.
South Korea was able to do something called basically tracking and tracing, where they were able to pinpoint down anyone and everyone who had it, who they contacted, who they connected with for the past 2 weeks, and effectively figure out where it was, quarantine it, and stop the spread. And their economy is pretty much working as it's supposed to. And they have really not suffered the really harmful effects that we have for as long. And they're actually starting to reopen up everything. Now, here in the United States...
Well, it's also with South Korea, they learned from their last epidemic of MERS. They were a big problem with that. And so what they did immediately was put in these guidelines and put in everything that when that were to come up again, they would already have systems in place. They immediately started looking up ways to how to test coronavirus. They immediately shipped all those tests out, mass produced them, shipped them all out to where they needed to go. And yeah, exactly. They had, trace tracking where not only did they, whenever someone tested positive, they found out who else they were in contact with, where they went. They actually did I don't know if you saw the video by Vox. They had a great video about it where they did, they were tracking their phones, where they were at, and so then whenever someone would pass, go through that path where the person who was positive, whenever they would go through that path, they would get a little alert on their phone that, hey, you just went through a path of someone who has been since tested positive for coronavirus. You need to come in and get tested as well.
Yeah. And they basically tested their entire population, everyone.
Yeah. Immediately.
So I guess what we want to do is we want to go back even further. Why did this happen? I read a book a couple years ago by a guy named Michael Lewis. I don't know if you've read him or know who he is, but he's the guy who wrote Moneyball. He's the guy who wrote The Big Short. The Big Short was about 2008, and essentially what we were just talking about, people buying tranche debt with the understanding that it was going to fail and that they would be bailed out to do it. It was about the housing market. Basically, it was about people who knew it was going to fail, and they bet that it was going to fail because the system was going to collapse. And he basically followed around 3 people who had predicted it, who knew it was happening, and what was going on. Moneyball was about baseball. And it was about a group of people who decided that they were going to predict how baseball was going to be played. And they were going to use statistics in order to do it. And basically, they revolutionized the way that baseball was run. He wrote a new book. It was called The Fifth Risk. It was about our government agencies and what was happening to them during the transition between the last administration and this one. And in that book, he detailed out how essentially that administration had created playbooks. We keep hearing about playbooks. They had created how to do their job, how to do it well. They had put a system in place to be able to train those people that were going to be new and coming in and taking over for months. And they literally had it scheduled out to the day, to the hour, to the second of what they would learn, how they would learn it, and what they were going to be able to do to make sure that nobody ever made the same mistakes that they did and that they weren't coming into it fresh. And the first day that the new people from the new administration were supposed to come in, they cleared out the parking lots, they got all the government agencies ready for it, and no one came. And day 2, no one came. And 2 weeks later, no one came. And the third week, some people came for a classified briefing that they weren't actually able to get and had to be sent home. And then on the day that they were supposed to transition and take over, they were supposed to already have a month's worth of understanding. All these people flooded the parking lots and started taking their new jobs in positions of authority and in positions of leadership that had no idea what they were doing and had no idea how to run the industries and the agencies that they were supposed to be doing and overseeing, and basically their jobs, because they didn't come to orientation. Now, one of those orientation packets was pandemic response. It was, here's what happens if there is a pandemic or an outbreak. Here is how you track it. Here is how you trace it. Here are the industries you need to fire up. Here are the ventilator companies that we need to put in orders with. Here is literally every single thing that you are supposed to do and how to do it, and a guideline. Did we do any of those things?
But also the problem is, well, one, no, but also remember how just high volume of, kind of a turnaround thing is for the Trump administration. People are coming and going so often that the people that should have been taught by the last administration aren't even there anymore.
And the reason was because they got run out. So those are lower level people, the actual scientists, the actual experts, people like Dr. Fauci. Now, Dr. Fauci may not be here much longer as far as we know, simply because the White House put out a statement that said that he was not going to be fired, which, as we know, means he's got about 3 days left.
Well, also, Trump retweeted something with #FireFauci last night.
So that's not great news.
No.
So basically what we have is a complete cluster. We knew what to do. They knew what to do. All the experts knew what to do. They were supposed to be trained. They didn't show up for orientation. And then 3 or 4 or a year later, they were fired and replaced with somebody else who still didn't get an orientation. And everything about everything that we do in government that is done well by experts, by people who have literally given their lives to the study of these things, they were not followed. And they're still not being followed. And so what happened was we weren't able to isolate it. We weren't able to track and trace it, which means we have to take the worst possible outcome, which is basically shutting down everything, closing the doors to everywhere. And eventually, hopefully, once we have it isolated, then we're able to come back out. The problem is if we don't isolate it, then it's here forever. And we're just going to have worse and worse flu seasons.
Well, that's not even the worst part about this all. I mean, that's not good. The worst part about it all is the sheer volume of deaths that we're seeing that did not have to take place. If we would, Dr. Fauci said it last night, which is the one thing that Trump got all upset about, was he said that if they would have acted sooner, they would not have seen this much death. They probably wouldn't have had to shut down everything. But because Trump for 7 weeks basically ignored it. Yeah, he closed down travel to China, and he ultimately closed down. Yeah, he ultimately closed down everything from Europe and all
3
that.
weeks late.
But by that time it was too late. There's New York Times had an article saying that one of the Department of Veterans Affairs doctors wrote in an email on January 28th, and he said, quote, "The projected size of the outbreak already seems hard to believe." And that was on January 28th. And guess what? We didn't do anything until the end of March.
And so basically what we have had happen is the United States now has the highest rate of deaths in the world per day. We are very close to the highest number of deaths total. We have the highest number of cases in the entire world. And at this point, we are under lockdown. And again, none of this had to happen. We had H1N1. We had Ebola. We had all of these other pandemics that could have been as bad as this one was. The difference is we actually did what we were supposed to do. And the people who are experts and the people who literally do this for a living were allowed to do their work. And at this point, they're not. And so that's kind of where we're at right now. We got a couple minutes left. Cody, anything else we want to hit?
No, I mean, we could go on for another hour and a half talking about how, Trump ended certain agencies and ended certain task forces and all different kinds of things. But no, I mean, I think we definitely covered it.
I forgot one other thing. So individual states began to basically form alliances with each other in order to get protective gear for their hospitals. And each of the individual states started to put in orders. And other countries also started to put in orders. And there was a shipment of masks and other things going to Germany. And basically, as it was on its way, it was confiscated by the United States government and brought here for our national stockpile. So we just took one of our biggest allies and basically did a full-on pirate raid, essentially what it was, of their stocks that they had legally bought and put contracts in for, and we stole it. And also, basically, we are doing the exact same thing to some of our individual states right now with their gear and ventilators. There are a few states like Michigan and others that have put in requests for more ventilators, and Washington has not granted them. And then you have other places that have some of the lowest number of people that are sick at this point and still have plenty of ventilators, and they are getting excesses of ventilators simply because of politics. And so at this point, people are living and dying because of pettiness and grudges, and because basically nobody actually knows what they're doing. And the people that do have either been fired, are on the brink of being fired, or they're just not allowed to do their jobs.
Well, the problem is, it's who we have as a president is someone who, this has been a very common pattern of behavior is if you're nice to him, you get stuff. If you don't, you're not. The point that I laughed at, a few seconds ago was, you said that states have kind of had to all come together and team up to do this. And that's just the scariest, most ridiculous thing possible, that states, governors, and everyone have had to go, we're not going to get help from this administration. We're going to have to figure it out on our own.
I mean,
and that's
Cody,
just
the Articles of Confederation. What was it? Articles of Federation? It worked really well, right?
Yeah, right, yeah. It's just
I mean, we had to form a government because, I don't know, things like this didn't work, and the borders were getting shut down, and interstate commerce didn't work, and basically we were fighting amongst ourselves. And so basically we are right back in the same situation that the United States was before we even formed the federal government. And it's basically a free
But hey,
for all.
the federal government has to be small, and the federal government has to be, non-existent.
What's the famous quote? I don't want to get rid of the federal government. I just want to make it small enough so we can drag it to the bathtub and drown it. Well,
Yeah,
we have now seen exactly what happens when it is small enough to drag to the bathtub and drown. And it means that a lot of people die with it. So, on that cheery note, we've got Dr. Jessie Hawkins coming up right after the break. So stick with us. It's great to see you again. Have a good one.
Great. You too, buddy. Bye.
I'ma socialize at a distance. I'm living my best life, minding my business. And my anti-socials for the win-win. Lockdown, I'ma staying in. Ramen noodles every night from my den. Hulu binge watching episodes of Ben 10. Yeah. And I got T-Raw for assistance. Bad boy, I'ma at the ball like a piston. In quarantine, I'm the quarterback. MVP, I'm scoring that. In the fool here. Shout out DoorDash. Where the napkins? I need more of that. Hey, can't find the remote. Out of control. Out of my mind. Out of my hands. Out of my soul. Under the code. Got my locks blinded in gold. I'm in a house and I'm so damn bored. I'm in a house like Corey. Where you could find me like Dory. He keeping me on her story. Sunning them all like a Maury. My competition is boring. I'm bored in the house and I'm bored. Okay, I'm bored in the house and I'm in the house bored. Bored in the house and I'm in the house bored.
Hi, we are back with Dr. Jessie Hawkins at the Franklin Institute of Health Sciences to discuss the pandemic, what our response was supposed to be, who's being hit the hardest, and basically everything to do with the science side of things that most people don't know about or really didn't care about until about 2 weeks ago. So, if you just want to introduce yourself and kind of say what you do and your thoughts.
Sure, yeah. So I'm a health researcher. My background is in health behavior and epidemiology, and the bulk of my day is spent conducting clinical research. We tend to focus on integrative health, but we integrate epidemiological research methods into the work that we do. So when it comes to these pandemics or outbreaks, any of that kind of stuff, then it's right up our alley, right what we were trained to do.
So what is an epidemiologist? I know a lot of people have heard the term in the last couple of days or couple of weeks, but have no idea what it actually means. They just think it's some science nerd person.
It is. It is a science nerd person. So we're not skin doctors. That's the question we normally get prior to this. Basically, we study the spread of disease. So what causes people to get sick? And then there's a lot of different types of epidemiologists. There are infectious disease epidemiologists who focus on things like COVID. There are environmental epidemiologists who answer questions like, does BPA disrupt your hormones? The field is really vast and really diverse, but basically we figure out what makes people sick and how can we not do those things.
Okay. So in other words, you're having fun right now.
This is, I don't know any epidemiologist that's sleeping right now. There's so much going on.
So basically, you've been putting out some posts lately on Facebook and other social media, just trying to kind of debunk some of the claims that have been going on, or just like try to clear up some basic things that, people are hearing terms that they've never heard before, like asymptomatic or other things like that. And just, kind of walk us through some of the biggest misconceptions that you're seeing right now, because obviously it's spreading. We need to stay inside. Can you explain why we need to stay inside, why the spread is happening as quickly as it has, especially here in the United States? And then obviously who's being hit the hardest right now?
Sure. So anytime we have something like this that is a novel, we call it a novel, just basically a new disease that humans have never had before, then everyone is vulnerable. And we work actually very integrated as a community. And so I benefit personally from the diseases that you're immune to, and you benefit personally from what I'm immune to. And so even when we have like flu outbreaks that are happening every year, then we have a subset of the population that's already immune to the flu. Plus we have a vaccine, so we have people who are getting that vaccine and then they're not going to get the flu. And so we only have a small group of the population that are actually vulnerable and can get the flu. With a new disease, nobody's immune to it at all. There's no vaccine, there's no natural immunity, there's no prior immunity. And so it's really scary from our side when we see something like this come out, because every single person is a possible victim. And then what we know is that people with certain underlying conditions and a lack of access to resources are going to be hit the hardest anytime there's any sort of pandemic like this. And that's a big part of what public health does in non-pandemic situations, is pinpoint and identify people who are at the greatest risk and see what we can do to eliminate some of those health disparities. And as a whole, we've not been doing too great on that over the last few years. We have a lot of people still who are uninsured, who don't have access to care, a lot of hospitals that have closed down, just basic stuff, basic resources that people need to stay healthy and to become healthy and to address underlying conditions such as diabetes or hypertension. And so what we're seeing so far is that when the novel virus or the new virus comes into the US, it's exploiting our very broken system. And it's going straight to those people who have not already had access to care, who have not already been getting the treatments that they need to get, who live in areas where those hospitals are closed down. So we see on the news that, New York is a disaster zone, and it absolutely is because of the population density there, because so many people live there. We're going to see those sky-high numbers there. But in our more rural areas, in our smaller communities, the actual toll on individual people is much greater, because we have far more people who are vulnerable, especially in the South. We have far more people with some of those underlying conditions that are not being treated. And what we're seeing so far is that the people who are actually dying from COVID are disproportionately people of color and people without access to resources.
I think what was the stat, and Atlanta, it was like 60 or 70% of all the people
Right.
who were actually dying were African American, when they only make up like a 20 or 30% of the population. And so they're dying 2 or 3 times more.
Right.
They're 2 or 3 times more likely to die than any other group. And so you have been talking a little bit online. One of the reasons that I really enjoy and I really wanted to talk to you is because you kind of go unfiltered online, which is wonderful, especially when you're talking to people who are very certain of what they don't know. And they have no scientific background, but they've read something on Facebook and now they are experts. And so if you could kind of explain, you did a post on asymptomatic versus pre-symptomatic. So obviously people are hearing the term asymptomatic, and you have some governors and some other people who are supposed to be leaders who are like, oh, we didn't even know this existed or it could happen. And so therefore we didn't close down the beaches, and we didn't stop the frat parties, and we didn't stop people from, giant congregations going to the same locations. And so can you just kind of explain what asymptomatic is, and then what the other one is as well?
Sure. So these are, again, terms that I don't think anyone cared about until a couple of weeks ago. Asymptomatic basically just means no symptoms. You're not having any symptoms at all.
But you have
But you have a disease, yeah. And so you can test positive for the disease. And the most important thing is that if you're asymptomatic, you actually go through the entire cycle of the disease to the point that you test negative for the disease and you don't show symptoms at all the entire time. So asymptomatic is not the same as I had a cough and a headache a month ago, I think I had it. That would be mild symptoms. By definition, those are symptoms. So asymptomatic is literally, I had no idea this was happening to me. I had 0 symptoms. And a lot of politicians, a lot of journalists, a lot of people are talking about asymptomatic spread. And yes, that's a concern, but really what they're talking about, what they're referring to, is pre-symptomatic spread. And so the important thing with COVID, and the reason it's so risky, is that you could have it right now and you don't know. You could have gotten it last week and you might not know for another week. We're seeing that it takes on average a week to actually see those symptoms, and in some cases as many as 3 weeks to see those symptoms. And so you're going to test positive, but you're going to also show symptoms later on. And so you're not technically asymptomatic, you're pre-symptomatic. And that's actually, from an epidemiological point of view, far more concerning, because symptoms are how a lot of these conditions spread. Once you start coughing, you're propelling those respiratory droplets out into the air at everyone. So if you're not coughing, then technically speaking, you're a little bit safer than someone who is coughing. So those very early stages of illness are not technically asymptomatic, they're pre-symptomatic. So someone's still building up that viral load, they just aren't showing those symptoms just yet.
And so obviously, when this started to be realized that it was as big of a deal as it was, the NBA season got canceled, as well as all the other things that happened within like one day. And people were like, oh, now I need to pay attention. The CDC just decided that people should probably be wearing masks in public. But when in reality, we've been seeing in other countries, especially East Asian countries, where they were wearing masks way before this and during it, leading up to it. So what specifically, is the CDC saying are we supposed to be doing when it comes to PPE in public as well as masks? What is it that would be most effective at this point to stopping the spread?
So the most effective thing from an epidemiological point of view is we want to find all the cases and we want to isolate those cases. So we focus on isolating cases by testing and figuring out who has it and then keeping them home until we're certain that they are no longer contagious. But that ship has kind of sailed because we're not conducting the testing that we need to conduct. And so that's where we see the shift into the social distancing and even some of the shutdowns. That is all symbolic of a complete failure to do what we are supposed to do in a pandemic situation. We've known in public health that we have an upper respiratory pandemic on the way. We've been warning about it for decades. We've had playbooks with what we should do when it happens. And and it really should have been addressed early on. So the social distancing, the stay 6 feet away from people, was kind of a stopgap, if you will. It's to buy us time to find all the cases and to shut them down. Well, then that didn't work. Like you said, there were still the frat parties. It was a state-by-state thing, and some governors were doing it partially. Some governors were really doing shutdowns. And again, it was just a complete, utter failure of a concentrated effort to contain this. And so that's where you see a shift towards the PPE in public. Masks there are risks and benefits to wearing them. And epidemiologists were really concerned about the recommendation for masks because more often than not, they provide a false sense of security, and people think, I've got a mask on, I don't have to social distance anymore, I don't have to stay home anymore, I've got this bulletproof vest on. And the reality is it's a poor substitute for social distancing, but if people are not going to stay home, then we at least want to prevent them from getting other people sick. And so it is, again, kind of one more step away from really what we should be doing, which is testing and isolating those cases. So we know where the cases are, we can keep them away from people. So it's kind of a sign that we're going downhill, if you will, that we're not making progress towards containment of the virus.
So in some countries like Singapore as well as South Korea, they were able to actually, and correct me if I'm wrong, I mean, it's biology, it's been a long time ago in college. I mean, that's what I graduated in, but it's been a few years. In Singapore, they were basically able to test enough people to figure out exactly where it was, isolate it, and then separate those people until there were no more symptoms, they were not able to spread it, and then it died, and therefore they were good. And then that's what should have happened here, but we didn't have the testing capability. And by the point where it would have been effective, it was no longer effective to be able to test everyone and isolate it. So then basically we've gone to social distancing, but again, we didn't do that soon enough, and we still had people going to the beach and outside and sporting events and church and other places. And so we have gotten to the next step, which is wearing PPE in public, which still is probably not going to help stop the spread of it. It may just contain it a little bit, or what specifically? And then what is the next step? Does it become endemic? Is it here with us at all the time? Or like what is obviously the one I can think of is HIV and AIDS. Is that, it got spread around so quickly, so rapidly, and so widely that now we just have to understand that it's going to be here with us and that we're never actually going to be able to eradicate it.
Right. So that's all exactly right. South Korea is a really good example of this because they had their first identified case the same day that we did. And so they had the same potential that we had, and they addressed it through testing. And so the thing about a virus is that it's different from bacteria in that it can only replicate inside of a living cell. So if there's not another person for it to infect, we can get rid of it, just like we did smallpox. And we have a history of doing this. We know how to do this. But to do it, we have to know where it is. And so as long as we can isolate it, if we're testing every possible case, everyone who's coming in from a potential area, everyone who meets the criteria if they get tested, and then we isolate those cases sufficiently, then it can't spread any further because we know where it is and we've contained it. But once we hit community spread, once people were getting it where we didn't know where they were getting it, we couldn't track it back to a previous case, that's when we knew we were in trouble. And that's when it really is, unleashed now. And until we get, there's a lot of talk about a vaccine, and it'll take 12 to 18 months at best to get a vaccine. It's important to keep in mind that that's not our end goal necessarily either, because we have to not just have a vaccine, but we have to have everyone get vaccinated. And that is a process that takes years because we have so many people who don't even believe that the virus is a threat anymore. And so when we look back at history, we see that's a 5 to 10 year process. So by that point, it's endemic. It's going to be here. So our hope is that we can do kind of like what we've done with measles, where we can get as many people vaccinated as possible. and get the herd immunity in place so we can get the numbers down. But in terms of eradication, we now have a huge battle ahead of us to actually make it go away so we can return to where we were beforehand.
So what does all this look like? What does it look like for, kids going back to school? What does it look like for, sports teams getting back in action, next year? Obviously, spring sports for high school have been canceled. College has been canceled. They're trying to extend those periods and seasons. But what does it look like going forward if we don't contain it, if we don't eradicate it, if we don't isolate it? When does it all get normal?
So we're going to have a new normal. We're going to have to create a new normal. And it's kind of just like all the things in the past. Culture has shifted dramatically after the last big pandemic that we had, after the world wars that we had. Anytime you have a substantial loss of life that just kind of comes out of nowhere and takes out a big portion of the world, then you create new normals. And so our new normal, I think, is going to have a much bigger emphasis on public health. We won't necessarily go to Disney anymore and touch everything and stand so close to each other in line. We'll be more aware of the person who's sniffling and sneezing next to us. We'll be more aware of hand hygiene and social distancing, with strangers in public. We'll probably see large places like sporting events and places like that, amusement parks, reducing their capacity. Because the important thing is that we can't just open the floodgates and send everyone back out, or we will have a second wave and it will be worse than the first. We've got to let it kind of trickle back out, and we've got to maintain these new habits that we've developed so that we're constantly thinking about how we can keep from getting it until we can build up that herd immunity.
How deadly is it compared to the flu and other things that we live with right now?
It is far more deadly than the flu. Exact numbers are going to vary quite a bit, and a lot of that is going to depend on your population, which is completely normal. We refer to that as generalizability. When you evaluate how it impacts a certain population or culture or community, you have to be really careful extrapolating those findings and applying them to a different culture, because there are so many things that are different between the two. We do know that it is more deadly than the flu. We don't know exactly how deadly it is. And one of the reasons we see extreme variations in numbers is, again, first of all, we're not testing, so we don't have a proper denominator to calculate how deadly it is. But second of all, the number of people who die will have everything to do with how many people can get treatment. And that's why there's the big flatten the curve campaign, because we don't want to overwhelm our hospitals. If all of a sudden everyone were to get it at once, the hospitals would be full, the doctors would be sick, the nurses would be sick, and then we'd see death rates skyrocket. We might see 4, 5, 6% death rates. What we've seen so far from countries doing a better job, if we were to try and extrapolate from there, it looks like about 1, maybe 1.5% of people who get it die. In China, we saw that disproportionately towards older people, depending on which study you cite, over 60 or over 70. But like I said before, in the South, we're seeing it disproportionately hit younger people and people of color.
Is that because China wasn't really testing younger people?
That's one of the... that would explain the infection rate, the incidence rate. We are seeing, again, South Korea, where they've done such a great job, they have a lot more cases in young people, but it's still the most deadly in the older people. They're the ones with the stronger symptoms. Again, here, though, that's all flipped on its head. We're seeing it disproportionately hit younger people here. And again, we know we're doing insufficient testing.
So what, I keep hearing that, the peak is going to come in 2-3 weeks. The peak is going to come in 2-3 weeks. What does that mean, and what is the difference between, you talked about this a little bit, a peak and a plateau? Obviously, those are two very different things because they sound different, but what does that actually mean? And what can we do to make sure that, it's not as bad as it could be? Because, even today, they were coming out with newspaper articles that basically said, we're doing such a great job that maybe the death rate won't be 1 to 200,000. It'll only be 60 to 70. And then you have all these people championing the fact that we're not going to see the worst case scenario.
Right. So a peak and a plateau, basically we plot deaths on a bell curve. So you've got kind of your shapes here. And they
What is a bell curve? What does that look like?
Let me actually see if I might have a textbook right here in front of me with one. It is basically shaped like a bell, and it's kind of the core of everything we do and don't. Everything that we do with epidemiology and statistics. So if we were to take, let's say, the height of every male in Florida, and we were to plot them all on a graph, you would see there's kind of an average where the bulk of people are going to be, so it's going to be taller. And then you would have your extreme.
So it kind of goes like this, and then kind of goes down at the end?
Yes.
Okay.
So if we plot out the number of cases that we have as our height, and if this is time, this is number of days since it passed, then we expect it to kind of go like this and go up. And this is going to be where we have the most cases, followed by the most deaths. And then we're going to expect it to go back down. And so that peak, wherever that top number is, the most cases we diagnose in a single day is what everyone's talking about in the news when we hit that peak. But that's kind of based on a sharp increase and a sharp decrease, like an A shape, where you go from nothing to suddenly a whole bunch and then straight back down again. That's really bad in epidemiology. We don't like to see that. That means we've not done a good job at mitigating disaster. What we are going to actually see is more of a plateau, which is just like geography. You have a mountain peak where it just goes up and one person can stand at the top, or you have a plateau where you can build a whole house up on top of a mountain. And a plateau means that you're basically reducing that worst number. So if that worst number was going to be, I think at one point it was slated to be something like 3,000 Americans were going to die in just one day. So if we reduce that down to 1,500 Americans are going to die in that one day, we're also going to be spreading it out. And so that means we're going to have a longer period with that top number. And this is what we're seeing in Italy, for example, and we're starting to see it in New York. In Italy, they hit the top, and then they stayed there for about a week to 10 days before the numbers started kind of tapering off and dropping. Then in New York, it looks like it's starting to flatten off instead of going up, which is a great sign because we don't want it going up forever. But when it flattens off, it's not going to immediately go back down again. And so once you start to see it kind of taper off, that is the most important time for the social distancing, for all of the actions. We see that glimmer of hope, and that's what the news is talking about, and I really wish they wouldn't, because when they do, it sounds like, oh, we did it, we defeated it, now when can we reopen? But we're going to see these really high numbers for a week or two. So we're going to keep seeing, more Americans died today than any other day, or more people were diagnosed today than any other day. It's going to hover around that height or that plateau for a while, and then we still have to work to bring it back down.
How long is a while? A couple weeks, a month?
It's so the thing about epidemiology is it's not like predicting the weather, where we're just saying, like, here's what all the data says is going to happen. It looks like rain. Everything, every model, every prediction is based on human behavior. So it is 100% changeable. So the peak could be a week. We want to get it lower and longer versus really high, because that high point overwhelms our systems. If we do a good job, it could be 7 to 10 days. If we let up and reopen things, it could drag on a month or two. It's 100% dependent on us.
And that's just for the plateau. That's not for getting back to normal. So we're
right.
Obviously, China's had it for almost 5-6 months, and they're just starting to reopen. So, have we done a better or worse job than China has?
It's hard to say with any degree of certainty, since in both cases we're dealing with a lot of hidden evidence and kind of guesstimating at what the true numbers are. when you have a government that's trustworthy, when you have transparency, when you have the testing that's done appropriately, then you can say with certainty who's doing a good job. Like we can say with certainty South Korea is doing a great job. But in the absence of all of that, it really is not until the dust settles and you get in there and you really start analyzing the data and collecting new data that we can kind of retrospectively make those decisions.
Okay. So what you're saying is the United States has done a good or great job.
No.
So, what? Yeah. So how bad has it been?
It has been bad enough that every epidemiologist I know is dumbfounded. They trained us for a lot in epidemiology. I mean, you prepare for a lot of different scenarios because you basically try and pinpoint what could happen and then you try and stop it from happening. So the options are practically limitless. But what everything that we do depends on is having responsible leadership who consist of people who are listening to the experts in charge, clear health messages, and using all of the tools and resources that we've developed as a nation over the last couple of decades. We have had systems in place that tell us this is coming, this is what we need to do about it, this is what that's going to look like if this is the case, if this is the case. There was a high probability it was going to be a respiratory virus and a high probability it was going to come from China. None of that took anybody off guard. We knew it was past due. We had all of the protocols, all of the systems in place, and we've used none of them. We're not relying really on experts. We have help people on stage every day talking to us, but it is being censored a little bit. It's not just, we're actually getting a lot better information from people who used to be involved in national health. Dr. Tom Frieden, for example, the past director of the CDC, is giving some great, clear information. But what really took public health professionals off guard was we knew we had a plan. We knew we had resources. We knew we had tools. We knew we had a plan. And so when it came early on, we believed we were going to use the plan that we had and contain it. And we were really kind of all knocked off our feet at the utter incompetence that we've seen. Not using the test, trying to manipulate the numbers, gaslighting and lying to the public about what is actually happening, states fighting over supplies. These were things that no one had on their epidemiology bingo card, if you will.
Hey, I mean, look, the Articles of the Confederation worked for like 15 years. I'm just saying.
Yeah. So, yeah. So it's that part has been challenging, and that part has been the part that we're all kind of, that disinformation is a problem with a pandemic. That's one of the biggest enemies that we have. You don't expect disinformation to be coming from the administration that's in charge.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it's coming from them. It's coming from everyone all the way down to governors, to local officials, right, to election offices. I mean, we here in Florida, when we knew it was bad, we still held an election. And then Wisconsin just held an election. And so it's one of those things where it's, I mean, basically anything and everything that we possibly could have done wrong at this point, it seems like we have. Which means that basically, if things don't change drastically very shortly, we may not have our normal again for years, if ever.
We need competent leaders. We need people who either understand the science or are willing to, listen to experts outside of their own area of expertise. People who are not concerned about ratings, who don't care how their talks compare to The Bachelor or whatever it is. People who care about human lives. That's what we need, is people who will put everything else aside to focus on keeping their constituents alive. So
you're telling me that PhDs in economics shouldn't be giving us medical advice?
Yeah.
That's it? That's the whole talk? Okay.
That is the whole talk. That's just a firm, no, they should not.
How are your kids doing? I know that they're probably not in school at this point, or they're at home.
Yeah,
so what's that looking like?
Like a lot of other families, which is not on my bingo card at all for this year. My oldest, as you know, is studying abroad in England, so getting her home in light of the uncertainty with, again, the way that things were handled and the way that things were done.
I mean, basically, it was like the last helicopter out of Vietnam. Like,
yes. We had. I was, again, doing what I do, watching the numbers, watching the pandemic, figuring out when would be best to bring her home for her health. Not at all thinking we were having all these wacky decisions being made. And so then when the first travel ban went in and everyone's huddling at airports trying to buy tickets, we had already gotten her a ticket home. Then we had to turn around and bump it up. And
what was your reaction when you saw those photos?
It was a lot of swear words. It was just, because you have all of these people who are stressing out, who are huddled together, who are bidding against each other over ticket. This is just not how any of it's done. It's just sheer and utter incompetence. You have to set that stuff in place. You have to have plans in order to accomplish things. You don't rule by tweet and, give partial information and not have everything in place. And I know there are a lot of students who didn't get home. I mean, we're fortunate that we were able to move her tickets around and get her on the last nonstop flight to our airport, but a lot of people didn't.
I mean, the UK tried to jump to the very last stage, which was herd immunity.
Right, which that's not playing out very well either.
Yeah, I think their prime minister's sick.
Yes. We've been watching that. I think he just got out of the ICU today, so I think he's going to probably take a different approach in the future.
So what you're saying is that not having a firm handshake isn't going to be a detriment to me anymore?
Yeah, I don't think we're going to be shaking hands. I think greetings are going to be very, very different. Yeah.
No more kisses on the cheek?
No. I think even the Europeans are going to drop that one, and the New Yorkers.
Oh. It's a new normal.
It's the new normal. We will have a new normal that, on one hand, the public health professional in me is able to look at it and say, these are all the things we've been pleading with you to do for ages. So this is going to be great in like 5 years when this is behind us, and flu rates are down and all these other things are down, because we're going to have ripple benefits from our new normal with a focus on public health.
Oh, we saw most of the diseases, I think, in China and South Korea and other places just because of the hand washing and other social distancing measures. All of the diseases went plummeting.
Yes. Yeah. And we're seeing that too. Flu cases this year are dramatically down because it's less contagious than COVID. So all the things we're doing to prevent COVID are also preventing the flu. So our flu season is basically almost over now. RSV cases in children, and even kind of trickle-down effects. We're seeing fewer car accidents and fatalities on the road because fewer cars are out. So some of those we'll see increase as more people get back on the road. They'll crash. But some of these things, we've all had a crash course in disease prevention, especially virus prevention lately. So long-term benefits of that will be useful. This isn't really the way we wanted everyone to learn about it, though.
Yeah. Well, I want to thank you for being here, telling us all the things that we don't know and terrifying the living bejesus out of me. So.
Nice.
Thanks, Jessie.
Yeah. Anytime.
I know a lot of you are scared. A lot of you are worried about whether or not you're going to be able to make your mortgage or pay your rent, about whether or not your job is going to be here when all this is over, or whether your small business is going to survive. We all lived through 2008, and we know what they're going to try to do. They're going to try to bail out the billionaires and the banks, the rich and the powerful, and they're going to leave people like you and me behind. But this time it has to be different. This time we have to stand up and say, we're not bailing out the people who are irresponsible with their money, the people who use it on stock buybacks. We're here to make sure that normal people like us survive and are made whole. My name's Adam Christensen. I'm running for Congress here in Florida. And this campaign, more than ever, it's for the many, not just me.